Today we're going to talk about the nocardia infection. The learning objectives are to understand the physiology and treatment of a nocardia infection. And relating this to our patient case, we had an ID attending physician, Dr. Deborah Walters, who noticed the appearance of an organism known as nocardia on a culture. Nocardia are part of the same taxonomic order, which is Actinomycetalis. However, there are actually a bunch of different species which are classified under the same genus, Nocardia. They all share the same filamentous branching pattern as you could see in the slides on the right. They're gram-positive bacteria, and they're characterized as opportunistic pathogens, meaning that they typically don't infect healthy individuals. They're both anaerobic and aerobic, so they can survive in oxygen or no oxygen, and they're not actually found in the normal human flora. They're usually environmental pathogens found in soil and dust, and the most common route of entry for human beings is through inhalation, and that's going to affect the lungs, as we'll discuss in the clinical implications. Nocardia has a kind of interesting pathophysiology. Typically, it's not actually infectious. However, when it grows in the filamentous form, which is known as log phase, they become resistant to phagocytosis. This is accomplished by a number of mutations which allow them to lose their cell wall, which is most likely a common pathogen-associated molecular pattern, which is used by phagocytotic cells to trigger an immune response. Phagocytotic cells are important in killing the L phase, but they're not actually going to be doing the killing itself. Instead, they send triggers for the immune response. It's the cell-mediated immunity, which is mostly accomplished by T cells, which are actually important for the killing of the pathogen. These cells will enhance phagocytosis by phagocytes, and they're involved in direct cytotoxicity as well. As I mentioned earlier, nocardia infections are going to be pretty rare in healthy individuals. It's likely that if a patient is infected with nocardia, they're immunocompromised. Immunocompromisation can happen due to a number of different risks. Genetic causes such as CGD and SCID eliminate the immune response altogether. HIV destroys the T cell response, and as we discussed earlier, T cell response is very important for clearing the nocardia infection. Certain drugs, such as glucocorticoids for therapy, also inhibit the immune system, as does chemotherapy. Organ transplant patients are usually put on immunosuppressive drugs, so it's likely that if you see a nocardia infection in an organ transplant patient, it's because they were on those immunosuppressive drugs. Lung pathology accounts for about 2/3 of the clinical symptoms you'll see with nocardia patients. However, in some rarer cases, there might actually be spreading to the central nervous system. Usually this is preceded by an infection in the lungs, and then it spreads to the CNS, where it may form a parenchymal abscess in any part of the brain. This is particularly dangerous and means that you have to treat nocardia pretty quickly. Skin infections are relatively uncommon, and they only really happen in people that may have been exposed to environmental pathogens, such as farmers, where an open wound may allow the nocardia to spread to the subcutaneous areas, or the skin. Usually this leads to ulcerations, pyoderma, cellulitis, or some subcutaneous abscesses. But again, this is relatively rare. Treatment of nocardia is usually going to require a combination of drugs, and it really depends on the severity of the symptoms. The first-line drug is usually TMP-SMX, and it's usually indicated especially if the patient has pulmonary symptoms. If the patient is immunocompromised, you might want to give them secondary prophylaxis therapy, which will help stimulate the immune system. Additionally, you might want to take a patient that's on glucocorticoids off the glucocorticoids before you start this treatment in order to get rid of the infection. Other drugs that are used include amikacin and impenem. This is usually indicated in severe cases. Usually impenem is combined with TMP-SMX if there is any CNS involvement. Another drug that has been shown to work are the third-generation cephalosporins, such as those that were prescribed to the patient in our case. Here are my references. This concludes the case.